Chapter 39 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 39. The Colonel Goes to Sleep. The condition of mind which could induce a peaceable, Christian-natured individual, who had, moreover, in the course of his career, been mixed up with enough bloodshed to have acquired a thorough horror of it, to offer to fight a duel is difficult to picture. Yet this condition has been reached by Harold Quaritch. Edward Cossey had wisely enough declined to entertain the idea, but the Colonel had been perfectly in earnest about it. Odd as it may appear in the latter end of this 19th century, nothing would have given him greater pleasure than to pit his life against that of his unworthy rival. Of course it was foolish and wrong, but human nature is the same in all ages, and in the last extremity we fall back by instinct on those methods which men have from the beginning adopted to save themselves from intolerable wrong and dishonour, or, be it admitted, to bring the same upon others. But Cossey utterly declined to fight. As he said, he had had enough of being shot, and so there was an end of it. Indeed, in after days the Colonel frequently looked back upon this episode in his career with shame not unmingled with amusement, reflecting when he did so on the strange potency of that passion which can bring men to seriously entertain the idea of such extravagances. Well, there was nothing more to be done. He might, it is true, have seen Ida, and working upon her love and natural inclinations, have tried to persuade her to cut the knot by marrying him off-hand. Perhaps he would have succeeded, for in such affairs women are apt to find the arguments advanced by their lovers weighty and well worthy of consideration. But he was not the man to adopt such a course. He did the only thing that he could do, answered her letter by saying that what must be must be. He had learned that on the day subsequent to his interview with his rival, the Squire had written to Edward Cossey, informing him that a decided answer would be given to him on Christmas Day, and thereon all vexatious proceedings on the part of that gentleman's lawyers had been stayed for the time. He could now no longer doubt what the answer would be. There was only one way out of trouble, the way that Ida had made up her mind to adopt. So he set out to work to make his preparations for leaving Honham and the country for good and all. He wrote to land agents and put Molehill upon their books to be sold or let on lease, and also to various influential friends to obtain introductions to the leading men in New Zealand. But these matters did not take up all his time, and the rest of it hung heavily on his hands. He mooned about the place until he was tired. He tried to occupy himself in his garden, but it is weary work sowing crops for strange hands to reap, and so he gave it up. Somehow the time wore on until at last it was Christmas Eve, the eve, too, of the fatal day of Ida's decision. He dined alone that night as usual, and shortly after dinner some waits came to the house and began to sing their cheerful carols outside. The carols did not chime in at all well with his condition of mind, and he sent 5 shillings out to them with a request that they would go away, as he had a headache. Accordingly they went, and shortly after their departure the great gale, for which that night is still famous, began to rise. Then he fell to pacing up and down the quaint old oak-panelled parlour, thinking until his brain ached. The hour was at hand, the evil was upon him and her whom he loved. Was there no way out of it, no possible way? Alas, there was but one way, and that a golden one. But where was the money to come from? He had it not, and as land stood it was impossible to raise it. Ah, if only that great treasure which old Sir James de la Molle had hid away and died rather than reveal could be brought to light, now in the hour of his house's sorest need. But the treasure was very mythical, and if it had ever really existed, it was not now to be found. He went to his dispatch box and took from it the copy he had made of the entry in the Bible, which had been in Sir James's pocket when he was murdered in the courtyard. The whole story was a very strange one. Why did the brave old man wish that his Bible should be sent to his son, and why did he write that somewhat peculiar message in it? Suppose that Ida was right, and that it contained a cipher or cryptograph which would give a clue to the whereabouts of the treasure. If so, it was obvious that it would be one of the simplest nature. A man confined by himself in a dungeon and under immediate sentence of death would not have been likely to pause to invent anything complicated. It would indeed be curious that he should have invented anything at all under such circumstances, and when he could have so little hope that the riddle would be solved. But, on the other hand, his position was desperate. He was quite surrounded by foes. There was no chance of him being able to convey the secret in any other way, and he might have done so. Harold placed the piece of paper upon the mantelpiece, and sitting down in an armchair opposite, began to contemplate it earnestly, as indeed he had often done before. In case the reader should not remember its exact wording, it is repeated here. It ran: "Do not grieve for me, Edward, my son, that I am thus suddenly and wickedly done to death by rebel murderers, for naught happened but according to God's will. And now farewell, Edward, till we meet in heaven. My moneys have I hid, and on account thereof I die unto this world, knowing that not one piece shall Cromwell touch. To whom God shall appoint shall all my treasure be, for naught can I communicate." Well, Harold stared and stared at this inscription. He read it forward, backward, crosswise, and in every other way, but absolutely without result. At last, wearied out with misery of mind and the pursuit of a futile occupation, he dropped off sound asleep in his chair. That happened about 11:15 o'clock. The next thing he knew was that he suddenly woke up completely, passing as quickly from a condition of deep sleep to one of wakefulness as though he had never shut his eyes. He used to say afterward that he felt as though somebody had come and aroused him. It was not like a natural waking. Indeed, so unaccustomed was the sensation that for a moment the idea flashed through his brain that he had died in his sleep and was now awakened to a new state of existence. This soon passed, however. Evidently he must have slept for some time, for the lamp was out and the fire dying. He got up and hunted about in the dark for some matches, which at last he found. He struck a light, standing exactly opposite to the bit of paper with the copy of Sir James de la Mole's dying message on it. This message was neatly copied longwise upon a half sheet of large writing paper, such as the Squire generally used. Its first line ran as it was copied: "Do not grieve for me, Edward, my son, that I am thus suddenly and wickedly done." Now, as the match burned up, by some curious chance, connected probably with the darkness and the sudden striking of the light upon his eyeballs, it came to pass that Harold, happening to glance thereon, was only able to read 4 letters of the first line of writing, with all the rest seeming to him but as a blur connecting those 4 letters. They were D, E, A, D, being respectively the initial letters of the first, the 6th, the 11th, and the 16th word of the line given above. The match burned out, and he began to hunt about for another. D, E, A, D, he said aloud, repeating the letters almost automatically. Why, it spells dead. That is rather curious. Something about this accidental spelling awakened his interest very sharply. It was an odd coincidence. He lit some candles and hurriedly examined the line. The first thing that struck him was that the 4 letters which went to make up the word dead were about equidistant in the line of writing. Could it be? He hurriedly counted the words in the line. There were 16 of them. That is, after the first, one of the letters occurred at the commencement of every fifth word. This was certainly curious. Trembling with nervousness, he took a pencil and wrote down the initial letter of every fifth word in the message, thus: D. Do not grieve for me, E. Edward my son, that I, A. am thus suddenly and wickedly, D. done to death by rebel, M. murderers, for naught happeneth but, A. according to God's will, and N. Now farewell, Edward, till we, S. shall meet in heaven. My M. moneys have I hid, and O. on account thereof I die, U. unto this world, knowing that N. not one piece shall Cromwell, T. touch. To whom God shall, A. appoint, shall all my treasures be, for naught can I, C. communicate. When he had done, he wrote these initials in a line: D-E-A-D M-A-N-S M-O-U-N-T A-B-C. Dead Man's Mount, A-B-C. Great heaven! He had hit upon the reading of the riddle. The answer was Dead Man's Mount, followed by the mysterious letters A-B-C. Breathless with excitement, he checked the letters again to see if by any chance he had made an error. No, it was perfectly correct. Dead Man's Mount. That was, and had been for centuries, the name of the curious tumulus or mound in his own back garden, the same that learned antiquarians had discussed the origin of so fiercely, and that his aunt, the late Mrs. Massey, had, at the cost of £250, erected a mushroom-shaped roof over, in order to prove that the hollow in the top had once been the agreeable country seat of an ancient British family. Could it then be but a coincidence that after the first word the initial of every fifth word in the message should spell out the name of this remarkable place, or was it so arranged? He sat down to think it over, trembling like a frightened child. Obviously it was no accident. Obviously the prisoner of more than 2 centuries ago had, in his helplessness, invented this simple cryptograph in the hope that his son, or if not his son, some one of his descendants, would discover it, and thereby become the master of the hidden wealth. What place would be more likely for the old knight to have chosen to secrete the gold than one that even in those days had the uncanny reputation of being haunted? Who would ever think of looking for modern treasure in the burying place of the ancient dead? In those days, too, Molehill, or Dead Man's Mount, belonged to the de la Mole family, who had reacquired it on the break-up of the Abbey. It was only at the Restoration, when the Dofferleigh branch came into possession under the will of the second and last baronet, Sir Edward de la Mole, who died in exile, that they failed to recover this portion of the property. And if so, and Sir James, the murdered man, had buried his treasure in the mount, what did the mysterious letters A.B.C. mean? Were they perhaps directions as to the line to be taken to discover it? Harold could not imagine, nor as a matter of fact did he or anybody else find out this either then or thereafter. Ida, indeed, used afterward to laughingly declare that the old Sir James meant to indicate that he considered the whole thing as plain as ABC, but that was an explanation which did not commend itself to Harold's practical mind. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 40. But not to bed. Harold glanced at the clock. It was nearly 1 in the morning. Time to go to bed if he was going. But he did not feel inclined to go to bed. If he did, with this great discovery on his mind, he should not sleep. But there was another thing. It was Christmas Eve, or rather Christmas Day, the day of Ida's answer. If any succour was to be given at all, it must be given at once, before the fortress had capitulated. Once let the engagement be renewed, and even if the money should subsequently be forthcoming, the difficulties would be doubled. But there, he was building his hopes upon sand, and he knew it. Even supposing that he held in his hand the key to the burial place of the long-lost treasure, who knew whether it would still be there, or whether rumour had not enormously added to its proportions? He was allowing his hopes and his imagination to carry him away. Still he could not sleep, and he had a mind to see if anything could be made of it. Going to the gun-room, he put on a pair of shooting boots, an old coat and an ulster. Next he provided himself with a dark lantern and the key of the summer-house at the top of Dead Man's Mount, and silently unlocking the back door, started out into the garden. The night was very rough, for the great gale was now rising fast, and bitterly cold, so cold that he hesitated for a moment before making up his mind to go on. However, he did go on, and in another 2 minutes was climbing the steep sides of the great tumulus. There was a wan moon in the cold sky. The wind whistled most drearily through the naked boughs of the great oaks, which groaned in answer like things in pain. Harold was not a nervous or impressionable man, but the place had a spectral look about it, and he could not help thinking of the evil reputation it had borne for all these ages. There was scarcely a man in Honham, or in Boisingham either, who could have been persuaded to stay half an hour by himself on Dead Man's Mount after the sun was well down. Harold had at different times asked one or two of them what they saw to be afraid of, and they had answered that it was not what they saw so much as what they felt. He had laughed at the time, but now he admitted to himself that he was anything but comfortable, though if he had had to put his feelings into words, he could probably not have described them further than by saying that he had a general sensation of somebody being behind him. However, he was not going to be frightened by this nonsense, so consigning all superstitions to their father the devil, he marched on boldly and unlocked the summer-house door. Now, though this curious edifice had been designed for a summer-house, and for that purpose lined throughout with encaustic tiles, nobody, as a matter of fact, had ever dreamed of using it to sit in. To begin with, it roofed over a great depression some 30 feet or more in diameter, for the top of the mount was hollowed out like one of those wooden cups upon which jugglers catch balls. But notwithstanding all the encaustic tiles in the world, damp will gather in a hollow like this, and the damp alone was an objection. The real fact was, however, that the spot had an evil reputation, and even those who were sufficiently well educated to know the folly of this sort of thing would not willingly have gone there for purposes of enjoyment. So it had suffered the general fate of disused places, having fallen more or less out of repair and become a receptacle for garden tools, broken cucumber frames, and lumber of various sorts. Harold got the door open and entered, shutting it behind him. It was, if anything, more disagreeable in the empty silence of the wide place, for the space roofed over was considerable, than it had been outside, and the question at once arose in his mind, what was he to do now that he had got there? If the treasure was there at all, probably it was deep down in the bowels of the great mound. Well, as he was on the spot, he thought that he might as well have a dig, though probably nothing would come of it. In the corner were a pickaxe and some spades and shovels. Harold got them, advanced to the centre of the space, and half laughing at his own folly, set to work. First, having lit another lantern which was kept there, he removed with the sharp end of the pickaxe a large patch of the encaustic tiles exactly in the centre of the depression. Then, having loosened the soil beneath with the pick, He took off his ulster and fell to digging with a will. The soil proved to be very sandy and easy to work. Indeed, from its appearance, he soon came to the conclusion that it was not virgin earth, but worked soil which had been thrown there. Presently his spade struck against something hard. He picked it up and held it to the lantern. It proved to be an ancient spearhead, and near it were some bones, though whether or no they were human he could not at the time determine. This was very interesting, but it was scarcely what he wanted, so he dug on manfully until he found himself chest deep in a kind of grave. He had been digging for an hour now and was getting very tired. Cold as it was, the perspiration poured from him. As he paused for breath, he heard the church clock strike 2, and very solemnly it sounded down the wild ways of the wind-torn winter night. He dug on a little more, and then seriously thought of giving up what he was somewhat ashamed of having undertaken. How was he to account for this great hole to his gardener on the following morning? Then and there he made up his mind that he would not account for it. The gardener, in common with the rest of the village, believed that the place was haunted. Let him set down the hole to the spooks and their spiritual activity. Still he dug on at his grave for a little longer. It was by now becoming a matter of exceeding labour to throw the shovelfuls of soil clear out of the hole. Then he determined to stop, and with this view scrambled, not without difficulty, out of the amateur tomb. Once out, his eyes fell on a stout iron crowbar which was standing among the other tools. Such an implement is used to make holes in the earth wherein to set hurdles and stakes, and it occurred to him that it would not be a bad idea to drive this crowbar into the bottom of the grave which he had dug, in order to ascertain if there was anything within its reach. Accordingly he once more descended into the hole, and began to work with the iron crow, driving it down with all his strength. When he had got it almost as deep as it would go, that is about 3 feet, it struck something hard, there was no doubt of it. He worked away in great excitement, widening the hole as much as he could. Yes, it was masonry, or if it was not masonry, it was something uncommonly like it. He drew the crow out of the hole, and seizing the shovel, commenced to dig again with renewed vigour. As he could no longer conveniently throw the soil from the hole, he took a skep or leaf basket which lay handy, and placing it beside him, put as much of the sandy soil as he could lift into it, and then lifted it and shot it on the edge of the pit. For 3/4 of an hour he laboured thus most manfully, till at last he came down to the stonework. He cleared a patch of it and examined it attentively by the light of the dark lantern. It appeared to be rubble work built in the form of an arch. He struck it with the iron crow, and it gave back a hollow sound. There was a cavity of some sort underneath. His excitement and curiosity redoubled. By great efforts he widened the spot of stonework already laid bare. Luckily the soil, or rather sand, was so friable that there was very little exertion required to loosen it. This done, he took the iron crow and, inserting it beneath a loose, flat stone, levered it up. This was a beginning, and having got rid of the large flat stone, he struck down again and again with all his strength, driving the sharp point of the heavy crow into the rubble beneath. It began to give. He could hear bits of it falling into the cavity below. There it went with a crash, more than a square foot of it. He leaned over the hole at his feet, devoutly hoping that the ground on which he was standing would not give way also, and tried to look down. The next second he threw his head back, coughing and gasping. The foul air rushing up from the cavity or chamber, or whatever it was, had half poisoned him. Then, not without difficulty, he climbed out of the grave and sat down on the pile of sand he had thrown up. Clearly he must let the air in the place sweeten a little. Clearly he must also have assistance if he was to descend into the great hole. He could not undertake that by himself. He sat there upon the edge of the pit, wondering who there was he could trust. Not his own gardener. To begin with, he would never come near the place at night, and besides, such people talk. The squire? No, he could not rouse him at this hour, and also for obvious reasons. They had not met lately. Ah, he had it. George was the man. To begin with, he could be trusted to hold his tongue, and the episode of the production of the real Mrs. Quest had taught the Colonel that George was a person of no common powers. He could think, and he could act also. He threw on his coat, extinguished the large stable lantern, and having passed out, locked the door of the summer-house and started down the mount at a trot. The wind had risen steadily during his hours of work, and was now blowing a furious gale. It was about 3:45 in the morning, and the stars shone brightly in the hard, clean-blown sky. By their light and that of the waning moon he struggled on in the teeth of the raging tempest. As he passed under one of the oaks he heard a mighty crack overhead, and guessing what it was, ran like a hare. He was none too soon. A circular gust of more than usual fierceness had twisted the top right out of the great tree, and down it came upon the turf, with a rending, crashing sound that made his blood turn cold. After his escape he avoided the neighbourhood of the groaning trees. George lived in a neat little farmhouse about 1/4 mile away. There was a short cut to it across the fields, and this he took, breathlessly fighting his way against the gale which swept and roared and howled in its splendid might as it came leaping across the ocean from its birthplace in the distances of air. Even the stiff hawthorn fences bowed before its breath, and the tall poplars on the skyline bent like a rod beneath the first rush of a salmon. Excited as he was, the immensity and grandeur of the sight and sounds struck upon him with strange and awful force. Never before had he felt so far apart from man, and so near that dread spirit round whose feet millions of rolling worlds rush on for ever, at whose word they are, endure, and are not. He struggled on until at last reached the house. It was quite silent, but in one of the windows a light was burning. No doubt its occupants found it impossible to sleep in that wild gale. The next thing was to consider how to make himself heard. To knock at the door would be useless in that turmoil. There was only one thing to be done: throw stones at the window. He found a good-sized pebble, and standing underneath, threw it with such good will that it went right through the glass, lighting, as he afterward heard, full upon Mrs. George's sleeping nose, and nearly frightening that good woman, whose nerves were already shaken by the gale, into a fit. Next minute a red nightcap appeared at the window. "George!" roared the Colonel in a lull of the gale. "Who's there?" came the faint answer. "I, Colonel Quaritch, come down. I want to speak to you." The head was withdrawn, and a couple of minutes afterward Harold saw the front door begin to open slowly. He waited till there was space enough and then slipped in, and together they forced it to. "Stop a bit, sir," said George. "I'll light the lamp." And he did. Next minute he stepped back in amazement. "Why, what on earth have you been after, sir?" he said, contemplating Harold's filth-begrimed face and hands and clothes. "Is anything wrong up at the castle, or is the cottage blown down?" "No, no," said Harold. "Listen. You've heard tell of the treasure that old Sir James de la Molle buried in the times of the Roundheads?" "Yes, yes, I've heard tell of that. Have the gale blown it up?" "No, but by heavens, I believe I am in a fair way to find it." George took another step back, remembering the tales that Mrs. Jobson had told, and not being by any means sure that the Colonel was not in a dangerous condition of lunacy. "Give me a glass of something to drink, water or milk, and I'll tell you. I have been digging all night, and my throat's like a lime kiln." "Digging? Why, where?" "Where? In Dead Man's Mount." "In Dead Man's Mount?" said George. "Well, blow me, if that ain't a funny place to dig on a night like this." and too amazed to say anything more, he went off to get the milk. Harold drank 3 glasses. Chapter 41 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 41. How the Night Went. George sat opposite to him, his hands on his knees, the red nightcap on his head, and a comical expression of astonishment upon his melancholy countenance. "Well," he said, when Harold had done, "blow me if that ain't a master one. And yet there's folks who say that there ain't no such thing as Providence. Not that there's anything provided yet. Perhaps there ain't nothing there after all. I don't know if there is or not, but I am going back to sea, and I want you to come with me now." "Now?" said George, rather uneasily. "Why, Colonel, that ain't a very nice spot to go digging about on a night like this. I niver heard no good of that place there. Not as I holds by such talk myself," he added apologetically. "Well," said the Colonel, "you can do as you like, but I am going back at once, and going down the hole too. The gas must be out of it by now. There are reasons," he added, "why, if this money is to be found at all, it should be found this morning. To-day is Christmas Day, you know." "Yes, yes, Colonel, I know what you mean. Bless you, I know all about it. The old squire must talk to somebody. If he don't he'd bust, so he talks to me. That Cossey's looking for his answer from Miss Ida this morning. Poor young lady, I saw her yesterday, and she looks like a ghost, she do. Ah, he's a mean one, that Cossey. Lorrequest warn't in it with him after all. Well, I cooked his goose for him, and I'd give summat to have a hand in cooking that banker chap's too. You wait a minute, Colonel, and I'll come along, gale and ghostesses and all. I only hope it mayn't be after a fool's errand, that's all." And he retired to put on his boots. Presently he appeared again, his red nightcap still on his head, for he was afraid that the wind would blow a hat off, and carrying an unlighted lantern in his hand. "Now, Colonel, I am ready, sir, if you be." And they started. The gale was, if anything, fiercer than ever. Indeed, there had been no such tempest in those parts for years, or rather centuries, as the condition of the timber by 10 o'clock that morning amply testified. "This here wind must be like that as the squire tells us on in the time of King Charles, as blew the top of the church tower off on a Christmas night," shouted George. But Harold made no answer, and they fought their way onward without speaking any more, for their voices were almost inaudible. Once the Colonel stopped and pointed to the skyline. Of all the row of tall poplars which he had seen bending like whips before the wind as he came along, but one remained standing now, and as he pointed that vanished also. Reaching the summer house in safety, they entered, and the Colonel shut and locked the door behind them. The frail building was literally rocking in the fury of the storm. "I hope the roof will hold," shouted George, but Harold took no heed. He was thinking of other things. They lit the lanterns, of which they now had 3, and the Colonel slid down into the great grave he had so industriously dug, motioning to George to follow. This that worthy did, not without trepidation. Then they both knelt and stared down through the hole in the masonry, but the light of the lanterns was not strong enough to enable them to make anything out with clearness. "Well," said George, falling back upon his favourite expression in his amazement, as he drew his night-capped head from the hole, "if that ain't a master one, I niver saw a masterer, that's all." "What are you going to do now, Colonel? Have you a ladder here?" "No," answered Harold, "I never thought of that, but I've a good rope. I'll get it." Scrambling out of the hole, he presently returned with a long coil of stout rope. It belonged to some men who had been recently employed in cutting boughs off such of the oaks as needed attention. They undid the rope and let the end down to see how deep the pit was. When they felt that the end lay upon the floor, they pulled it up. The depth from the hole to the bottom of the pit appeared to be about 16 feet, or a trifle more. Harold took the iron crowbar, and having made the rope fast to it, fixed the bar across the mouth of the aperture. Then he doubled the rope, tied some knots in it, and let it down into the pit, preparatory to climbing down it. But George was too quick for him. Forgetting his doubts as to the wisdom of groping about Dead Man's Mount at night, in the ardour of his burning curiosity, he took the dark lantern and, holding it in his teeth, passed his body through the hole in the masonry and cautiously slid down the rope. "Are you all right?" asked Harold, in a voice tremulous with excitement, for was not his life's fortune trembling on the turn? "Yes," answered George in a doubtful voice, and Harold, looking down, could see that he was holding the lantern above his head and staring at something very hard. Next moment an awful howl of terror echoed up through the pit. The lantern was dropped upon the ground, and the rope commenced to be agitated with the utmost violence. In another 2 seconds George's red nightcap appeared through the hole, followed by a face that was literally livid with terror. "Let me up, for God's sake," he gasped, "or he'll have me by the leg." "He? Who?" asked the Colonel, not without a thrill of superstitious fear, as he dragged the panting man through the hole. But George would give no answer until he was through the hole and out of the grave. Indeed, had it not been for the Colonel's eager entreaties, backed to some extent by actual force, he would have been out of the summer house and halfway down the mount by now. "What is it?" roared the Colonel in the hole to George, who, shivering with terror, was standing on the edge thereof. "It's a blessed ghost, that's what it is, Colonel," answered George, keeping his eyes fixed upon the hole as though he momentarily expected to see the object of his fears emerge. "Nonsense," said Harold doubtfully. "What rubbish you talk. What sort of ghost?" "A white un," said George, "all bones like." "All bones," answered the Colonel. "Why, it must be a skeleton." "I don't say that he ain't," was the answer, "but if he be, he's 7 foot high and sitting airing of hisself in a stone bath." "Oh, rubbish," said the Colonel. "How can a skeleton sit and air himself? He would tumble to bits." "I don't know, but there he is, and they don't call this place Dead Man's Mount for nothing." "Well," said the Colonel argumentatively, "a skeleton is a perfectly harmless thing." "Yes, if he's dead, maybe, sir, but this one's alive. I saw him nod his head at me." "Look here, George," answered Harold, feeling that if this went on much longer he should lose his nerve altogether. "I'm not going to be scared. Great heavens, what a gust! I am going down to see for myself." "Very good, Colonel," answered George, "and I'll wait here till you come up again. That is, if you ever do." Thrice did Harold look at the hole, and thrice, like false Sextus, did he shrink back. "Come," he shouted angrily, "don't be an infernal fool. Get down here and hand me the lantern." George obeyed with evident trepidation. Then Harold got through the hole, and with many an inward tremor, for there is scarcely a man on earth who is really free from supernatural fears, descended hand over hand. But in so doing he managed to let the lantern fall, and it went out. Now, as the reader will probably admit, this was exceedingly trying. It is not pleasant to be left alone in the dark, underground, in the company of an unknown spook. He had some matches, but what between fear and cold, it was some time before he could get a light. Down in this deep place the rush of the great gale reached his ears like a faint and melancholy sighing, and he had heard other tapping noises, or he thought he did, noises of a creepy and unpleasant nature. Would the matches never light? The chill and death-like damp of the place struck to his marrow, and the cold sweat poured from his brow. Ah, at last! He kept his eyes steadily fixed upon the lantern till he had lit it, and it was burning up brightly. Then, by an effort, he lifted his eyes and looked round him, and this is what he saw. There, 3 or 4 paces from him, in the centre of the chamber of death, sat, or rather lay, a figure of death. It reclined in a stone chest or coffin, like a man in a hip bath which was too small for him. The bony arms hung down on either side, the bony limbs projecting toward him. The great white skull hung forward over a massive breastbone. It moved too, of itself, and as it moved the jawbone tapped against the breast, and the teeth clicked gently together. Terror seized him while he looked, and as George had done, he turned to fly. How could that thing move its head? The head ought to fall off. Seizing the rope, he jerked it violently in the first effort of mounting. "Have he got you, Colonel?" sang out George above, and the sound of a human voice brought him back to his senses. "No," he answered as boldly as he could, and then, setting his teeth, turned and tottered straight at the horror in the chest. He was there now, and holding the lantern straight against the thing, examined it. It was a skeleton of enormous size, and the skull was fixed to the vertebra with rusty wire. At this evidence of the handiwork of man his fears almost vanished. Even in that company he could not help remembering that it is scarcely to be supposed that spiritual skeletons carry about wire with which to tie on their skulls. With a sigh of relief he held up the lantern and looked around. He was standing in a good-sized vault or chamber built of rubble stone. Some of this rubble had fallen in to his left, but otherwise, though the workmanship showed that it must be of extreme antiquity, the stone lining was still strong and good. He looked upon the floor, and then for the first time perceived that the nodding skeleton before him was not the only one. All round lay remnants of the mighty dead. There they were, stretched out in the form of a circle, of which the stone kist was the centre. One place in the circle was vacant. Evidently it had been once occupied by the giant frame which now sat within the kist. Next he looked at the kist itself. It had all the appearance of one of those rude stone chests in which the very ancient inhabitants of this island buried the ashes of their cremated dead. But if this was so, whence came the uncremated skeletons? Perhaps a subsequent race or tribe had found the chamber ready prepared, and used it to bury some among them who had fallen in battle. It was impossible to say more, especially as, with one exception, there was nothing buried with the skeletons which would assist to identify their race or age. That exception was a dog. A dog had been placed by one of the bodies. Evidently, from the position of the bones of its master's arms, he had been left to his last sleep with his hand resting on his hound's head. Bending down, Harold examined the seated skeleton more closely. It was, he discovered, accurately jointed together with strong wire. Clearly this was the work of hands which were born into the world long after the flesh on those mighty bones had crumbled into dust. But where was the treasure? He saw none. His heart sank as the idea struck him that he had made an interesting archaeological discovery, and that was all. Before undertaking a closer search, he returned to the hole and hallooed to George to come down, as there was nothing but some bones to frighten him. This the worthy George was at length, with much difficulty, persuaded to do. When at last he stood beside him in the vault, Harold explained to him what the place was and how ridiculous were his fears, without, however, succeeding in allaying them to any considerable extent. And really, when one considers the position, shut up as they were in the bowels of a place which had for centuries owned the reputation of being haunted, faced by a nodding skeleton of almost superhuman size, and surrounded by various other skeletons, all very fine and large, with the most violent tempest that had visited the country for years sighing away outside. It is not wonderful that George was scared. "Well," he said, his teeth chattering, "if this ain't the masterest one I ever did see." But here he stopped. Language was not equal to the expression of his feelings. Meanwhile Harold, with a heart full of anxiety, was turning the lantern this way and that, in the hope of discovering some traces of Sir James's treasure, but naught could he see. There to the left the masonry was fallen in. He went to it and pulled aside some of the stones. There was a cavity behind, apparently a passage, leading no doubt to the secret entrance to the vault, but he could see nothing in it. Once more he searched round. There was nothing. Unless the treasure was buried somewhere or hidden away in the passage, it was non-existent. That was all. And yet, what was the meaning of that jointed skeleton sitting in the stone bath? It must have been put there for some purpose, probably to frighten would-be plunderers away. Could he be sitting on the money? He rushed to the chest and looked through the bony legs. No, his pelvis rested on the stone bottom of the kist. "Well, George, it seems we're done," said Harold, with a ghastly attempt at a laugh. "There's no treasure here." "Maybe it's underneath that there stone corn bin," suggested George, whose teeth were still chattering. "It should be here or hereabouts, surely." This was an idea. Helping himself to the shoulder blade of some deceased hero, Harold, using it as a trowel, began to scoop away the soft sand upon which the stone chest stood. He scooped and scooped manfully, but he could not come to the bottom of the kist. He stepped back and looked at it. It must be one of two things. Either the hollow at the top was but a shallow cutting in a great block of stone, or the kist had a false bottom. He literally sprang at it, and seizing the giant skeleton by the spine, jerked it out of the kist and dropped it into a bristling bony heap on one side. Just as he did so there came a gust of wind so furious that, buried as they were in the earth, they literally felt the mound rock beneath it. Instantly it was followed by a frightful crash overhead. George collapsed in terror, and for a moment Harold could not for the life of him think what had happened. He ran to the hole and looked up. Straight above him he could see the sky, in which the first cold lights of dawn were quivering. Mrs. Massey's summer house had been blown bodily away, and the ancient British dwelling place was once more, as it had been for centuries, open to the sky. "The summer house is gone, George," he said. "Thank God that we're not in it, or we should have been gone too." "Oh Lord, sir," groaned the unhappy George, "this is an awful business. It's like a judgment." "It might have been if we had been up above instead of safe down here," he answered. "Come, bring that other lantern." George roused himself, and together they bent over the now empty kist and examined it closely. The stone bottom was not of quite the same colour as the walls of the kist, and there was a crack across it. Harold felt in his pocket and drew out his knife, which had at the back of it one of those strong iron hooks that are used to extract stones from the hoofs of horses. This hook he worked into the crack, and managed, before it broke, to pull up a fragment of stone. Then, looking round, he found among the rubbish, where the wall had fallen in, a long sharp flint. This he inserted into the hole, and they both levered away at it. Half of the cracked stone came up a few inches, far enough to allow them to get their fingers underneath it. So it was a false bottom. "Catch hold," gasped the Colonel, "and pull for your life." George did as he was bid, and setting their knees against the hollowed stone, they tugged till their muscles cracked. "It's a moving," said George. "Now then, Colonel." Next second they both found themselves on the flat of their backs. The stone had given with a run. Up sprang the Colonel like a kitten. The broken stone was standing edgeways in the kist. There was something soft beneath it. "The light, George," he said hoarsely. Beneath the stone were some layers of rotten linen. Was it a shroud or what? They pulled the linen out by handfuls. 1, 2, 3. Oh, great heaven! There, under the linen, was a row of shining gold coins set edgeways. For a moment everything swam before Harold's eyes, and his heart stopped beating. As for George, he muttered something inaudible about its being a master one, and collapsed. With trembling fingers Harold managed to pick out 2 pieces of gold which had been disturbed by the upheaval of the stone, and held them to the light. He was a skilled numismatologist, and had no difficulty in recognising them. One was a beautiful 3-pound piece of Charles I, and the other a spur royal of James I. That proved it. There was no doubt that this was the treasure hidden by Sir James de la Molle, and he it must have been also who conceived the idea of putting a false bottom into the kist and setting up the skeleton to frighten marauders from the treasure, if by any chance one should enter. For a minute or two the men stood staring at each other over the great treasure which they had unearthed in that dread place, shaking with the reaction of their first excitement, and scarcely able to speak. "How deep do it go?" said George. Harold got his knife and loosed some of the top coins, which were very tightly packed, till he could move his hand in them freely. Then he pulled out a handful after handful of every sort of gold coin. There was a rose noble of Edward the Fourth, double sovereigns of Henry the Eighth, triple sovereigns and gold crowns of Edward the Sixth, double rials, rials and angles of Mary, rose royals, spur royals, angles, large sovereigns and laurels of James I, double rials and rials of Elizabeth, 3-pound pieces, broads and half-broads of Charles I, some in greater quantity and some in less, but all were represented. Handful after handful did he pull out, and yet the bottom was not reached. At last he came to it. The layer of gold pieces was about 30 inches thick by 3 feet 6 long. "We must get this into the house, George, before any one is about," gasped the Colonel. "Yes, sir, yes. But how are we going to carry it?" Harold thought for a minute and then acted thus. Bidding George stay in the vault with the treasure, which he was with difficulty persuaded to do, he climbed the improvised rope ladder and got in safety through the hole. In his excitement he had forgotten about the summer house having been carried away by the gale, which was still blowing, though with not so much fury as before, and the wind-swept desolation that met his view as he emerged into the dawning light broke upon him with a shock. The summer house was clean gone, nothing but a few uprights remained of it, and 50 yards away he thought he could make out the crumpled up shape of the roof. Nor was that all. Quite a quarter of the great oaks which were the glory of the place were down or splintered and ruined. But what did he care for the summer house or the oaks now? Forgetting his exhaustion, he ran down the slope and reached the house, which he entered as softly as he could by the side door. Nobody was about yet, or would be for another hour. It was Christmas Day, and not a pleasant morning to get up on, so the servants would be sure to lie abed. On his way to his bedroom he peeped into the dining room, where he had fallen asleep on the previous evening. When he had woke up, it may be remembered, he lit a candle. This candle was now flaring itself to death, for he had forgotten to extinguish it, and by its side lay the paper from which he had made the great discovery. There was nothing in it, of course, but somehow the sight impressed him very much. It seemed months since he awoke to find the lamp gone out. How much may happen between the lighting of a candle and its burning away. Smiling at this trite reflection, he blew that light out, and taking another, went to his room. Here he found a stout handbag, with which he made haste to return to the Mount. "Are you all right, George?" he shouted down the hole. "Well, Colonel, yes, but not sorry to see you back. It's lonesome like down here with these deaders." "Very well, look out. There's a bag. Put as much gold in it as you can lift comfortably, and then make it fast to the rope." Some 3 minutes passed, and then George announced that the bag full of gold was ready. Harold hauled away, and with a considerable effort brought it to the surface. Then, getting the bag onto his shoulder, he staggered off with it to the house. In his room stood a massive sea-going chest, the companion of his many wanderings. It was about half full of uniforms and old clothes, which he bundled unceremoniously to the floor. This done, he shot the bag full of shining gold, as bright and uncorrupted now as when it was packed away 2.5 centuries ago, into the chest, and returned for another load. 20 times did he make this journey. At the 10th something happened. "Here's a writing, sir, with this lot," shouted George. "It was packed away in the money." He took the writing, or rather parchment, out of the mouth of the bag and put it in his pocket unread. At last the store, enormous as it was exhausted. "That's the lot, sir," shouted George, as he sent up the 20th bagful. "If you'll kindly let down that there rope, I'll come up too." "All right," said the Colonel. "Put the skeleton back first." "Well, sir," answered George, "he looks wonderful comfortable where he lay, he do, so if you're agreeable I think I'll let him be." Harold chuckled, and presently George arrived, covered with filth and perspiration. "Well, sir," he said, "I never did think that I should get dead tired of handling gold coins, but there's a rum world, and that's a fact. Well, I never, and the summer house gone, and just look at them there oaks. Well, if that ben't a master one." "You never saw a masterer, that's what you were going to say, wasn't it? Well, and take one thing with another, nor did I, George, if that's any comfort to you. Now look here, just cover over this hole with some boards and earth, and then come in and get some breakfast. It's 8 o'clock and past, and the gale is blowing itself out. A Merry Christmas to you, George," and he held out his hand, covered with cuts and grime and blood. George shook it. "Same to you, Colonel, I'm sure, and a Merry Christmas it is. God bless you, sir, for what you've done tonight. You've saved the old place from that banker chap, that's what you've done, and you'll have Miss Ida, and I'm darn glad on it, that I am. Lord, won't this make the Squire open his eyes?" And the honest fellow brushed away a tear and fairly capered with joy, his red nightcap waving on the breeze. It was a strange and beautiful sight to see that solemn George capering thus in the midst of that windy desolation. Harold was too moved to answer, so he shouldered his last load of treasure and limped off with it to the house. Mrs. Jobson and her talkative niece were up now, but they did not happen to see him, and he reached his room in safety. He poured the last bagful of gold into the chest and smoothed it down. It filled it to the brim. He shut the chest and locked it, and then, as he was covered with filth and grime, bruised and bleeding, and his hair flying wildly about his face, he sat down upon it, and from his heart thanked heaven for the wonderful thing that had happened to him. So exhausted was he that he nearly fell asleep as he sat, but remembering himself, he rose, and taking the parchment from his pocket, he cut the faded silk with which it was tied, and opened it. On it was a short inscription in the same crabbed writing which he had seen in the old Bible that Ida had found. It ran as follows: "Seeing that the times be so troublous that no man can be sure of his own, I, Sir James de la Molle, have brought together all my substance in money from wheresoever it lay at interest, and have hid the same in this sepulchre, to which I found the entry by a chance, till such time as peace come back to this unhappy England. This I have done on Christmas Day in the year of our Lord 1643, having completed the hiding of the gold while the great gale was blowing. James de la Molle." Thus, on a long-gone Christmas day, in the hour of a great wind, was the gold hid, and now on this Christmas day, when another great wind raged overhead, was it found once. Chapter 42 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 42. Ida goes to meet her fate. Most people of a certain age and a certain degree of sensitiveness of disposition, in looking back down the vista of their lives, whereon memory's melancholy light plays in fitful flashes like the alternate glow of a censer swung in the twilight of a tomb, can recall some one night of peculiar mental agony. It may have come when first we found ourselves face to face with the chill and hopeless horror of departed life, when, in our soul's despair, we stretched out vain hands and wept, called, and no answer came, when we kissed those beloved lips and sank aghast at the contact with their clay, those lips more eloquent now in the rich pomp of their unutterable silence than in the brightest hour of their unsealing. It may have come when our honour and hope of all our days lay at our feet shattered like a shred on the hard roadway of the world. It may have come when she, the sweet star of our youth, the pure and holy thing, the type of completed beauty and woman's most perfect measure, she to whom was given the chalice of our joy, and who held in her white hand the love-begotten germ of all our power, ruthlessly emptied and crushed it, and, as she became a star, slid down our horizon's way to rise upon some other sky. Or it may have come when Brutus stabbed us, or when a child whom we had cherished struck us with a serpent fang of treachery and left the icy poison to creep upon our heart. One way or another it has been with most of us, that long night of utter woe, and all will own that it is a ghastly thing to face. And so Ida de la Mole had found it. The shriek of the great gale rushing on that Christmas Eve round the stout Norman towers was not more strong than the breath of despair that shook her life. She could not sleep. Who could sleep on such a night, the herald of such a morrow? The wail and roar of the wind, the crash of falling trees, and the rattle of flying stones seemed to form a fit accompaniment to the turmoil of her mind. She rose, and putting on her dressing-gown, went to the window, and in the dim light watched the trees gigantically tossing in a great struggle for their life. An oak and a birch were within her view. The oak stood the gale out for a while. Presently there came an awful gust and beat upon it. It would not bend, and the tough roots would not give. So beneath the weight of the breath of its destiny, the big tree broke in two like a straw, and its spreading top was whirled into the moat. But the birch gave and bent. It bent till its delicate filaments lay upon the wind like a woman's streaming hair, and the fierceness of the gust wore itself away and spared it. "See what happens to those who stand up and defy their fate," said Ida to herself with a bitter laugh. "That birch has had the best of it." Ida rose and closed the shutters. The sight of the storm affected her already strained nerves almost beyond bearing. She began to walk up and down the big room, flitting like a ghost from end to end and back again and again back. What could she do? What should she do? Her fate was upon her. She could no longer resist the inevitable. She must marry him. And yet her whole soul revolted from the act with an overwhelming fierceness which astonished even herself. She had known two girls who had married people whom they did not like. being at the time, or pretending to be, attached to somebody else, and she had observed that they accommodated themselves to their fate with considerable ease. But it was not so with her. She was fashioned of another clay, and it made her faint to think of what was before her. And yet the prospect was one on which she could expect little sympathy. Her own father, although personally he disliked the man whom she must marry, was clearly filled with amazement that she should prefer Colonel Quaritch, middle-aged, poor and plain, to Edward Cossey, handsome, young and rich as Croesus. He could not comprehend or measure the extraordinary gulf which her passion had dug between the two. If, therefore, this was so with her own father, how would it be with the rest of the world? She paced her bedroom till she was tired, and then, in access of despair, which was sufficiently distressing in a person of her reserved and stately manner, flung herself, weeping and sobbing, upon her knees, and, resting her aching head upon the bed, prayed as she had never prayed before that this cup might pass from her. She did not know, how should she, that at that very moment her prayer was being answered, and that her lover was then, even as she prayed, lifting the broken stone and revealing the hoard of ruddy gold. But so it was. She prayed in despair and agony of mind, and the prayer, carried on the wild wings of the night, brought a fulfilment with it. Not in vain were her tears and supplications, for even now the deliverer delved among the dust and awful treasures of the dead, and even now the light of her coming happiness was breaking on her tortured night, as the first cold gleams of the Christmas morning were breaking over the stormy fury of the void without. And then, chilled and numbed in body and mind, she crept into her bed again, and at last lost herself in sleep. By 9:30, when Ida came down to breakfast, the gale had utterly vanished, though its footprints were visible enough in shattered trees, unthatched stacks, and ivy torn in knotty sheets from the old walls it clothed. It would have been difficult to recognise in the cold and stately lady who stood at the dining-room window, noting the havoc and awaiting her father to come in, the lovely, passionate, dishevelled woman who some few hours before had thrown herself upon her knees, praying to God for the succour she could not win from man. Women, like nature, have many moods and many countenances to express them. The hot fit had passed, and the cold fit was on her now. Her face, except for the dark hollows round the eyes, was white as winter, and her heart was cold as winter's ice. Presently her father came in. "What a gale!" he said. "What a gale! Upon my word, I began to think that the old place was coming down about our ears, and the wreck among the trees is dreadful. I don't think there can have been such a wind since the time of King Charles I, when the top of the tower was blown clean off the church. You remember, I was showing you the entry about it in the registers the other day, the one signed by the parson and old Sir James de la Mole. The boy who has just come up tells me that he hears that poor old Mrs. Massey's summer house on the top of Dead Man's Mount has been blown away, which is a good riddance for Colonel Quaritch. Why, what's the matter with you? How pale you look!" "The gale kept me awake. I got very little sleep," answered Ida. "And no wonder. Well, my dear, you haven't wished me a Merry Christmas yet. Goodness knows we want one badly enough. There has not been much merriment at Honham of late years." "A Merry Christmas to you, father," she said. "Thank you, my love, the same to you. You have got most of your Christmases before you, which is more than I have. God bless me, it only seems like yesterday since the big bunch of holly tied to the hook in the ceiling there fell down on the breakfast table and smashed all the cups, and yet it is more than 60 years ago. Dear me, how angry my poor dear mother was. She never could bear the crockery to be broken. It was a little failing of your grandmother's." and he laughed more heartily than Ida had heard him do for some weeks. She made no answer, but busied herself about the tea. Presently, glancing up, she saw her father's face change. The worn expression came back upon it again, and he lost his buoyant bearing. Evidently a new thought had struck him, and she was in no great doubt as to what it was. "We had better get on with breakfast," he said. "You know that Cossey is coming up at 10 o'clock." "10 o'clock?" she said faintly. "Yes, I told him 10 so that we could go to church afterwards if we wished to. Of course, Ida, I am still in the dark as to what you have made up your mind to do, but whatever it is, I thought that he had better once and for all hear your final decision from your own lips. If, however, you feel yourself at liberty to tell it to me as your father, I shall be glad to hear it." She lifted her head and looked him full in the face, and then paused. He had a cup of tea in his hand, and it was held in the air halfway to his mouth, while his whole face showed the overmastering anxiety with which he was awaiting her reply. "Make your mind easy, father," she said. "I am going to marry Mr. Cossey." He put the cup down in such a fashion that he spilled half of the tea, most of it over his own clothes, without even noticing it, and then turned away his face. "Well," he said, "of course it is not my affair, or at least only indirectly so. But I must say, my love, I congratulate you on the decision which you have come to. I quite understand that you have been in some little difficulty about the matter. Young women often have been before, and you will be again. But to be frank, Ida, that Quaritch business was not at all suitable, either in age or fortune, or in anything else. Yes, although Cossey is not everything that one might wish, on the whole I congratulate you heartily." "Oh, pray don't," broke in Ida, almost in a cry. "Whatever you do, pray don't congratulate me." Her father turned round again and looked at her, but Ida's face had already recovered its calm, and he could make nothing of it. "I don't quite understand you," he said. "These things are generally considered matters for congratulation." But for all he might say, and all he might urge in his mind to the contrary, he did more or less understand what her outburst meant. He could not but know that the exclamation was the last outcry of a broken spirit. In his heart he realised then, if he had never clearly realised it before, that this proposed marriage was a thing hateful to his daughter, and his conscience pricked him sorely. And yet, it was but a woman's fancy, a passing fancy. She would become reconciled to the inevitable, as women do, and when her children came she would grow accustomed to her sorrow, and her trouble would be forgotten in their laughter. And if not, well, it was but one woman's life which would be affected, and the very existence of his race, the very cradle that had nursed them from century to century, were now at stake. Was all this to be at the mercy of a girl's fancy? No, let the individual suffer. So he argued, and so at his age and in his circumstances most of us would argue also, and perhaps, considering all things, we should be right, for in this world personal desires must continually give way to the welfare of others. Did they not do so, our system of society could not endure. No more was said upon the subject. Ida made pretence of eating a piece of toast. The Squire mopped up the tea upon his clothes and then drank some more. Meanwhile the remorseless seconds crept on. It wanted but 5 minutes to the hour, and the hour would, she well knew, bring the man with it. The 5 minutes passed slowly and in silence, both her father and herself realising the nature of the impending situation, but neither of them spoke of it. Ah, there was the sound of wheels upon the gravel. So it had come. Ida felt like death itself. Her pulse sank and fluttered. Her vital forces seemed to cease their work. Another 2 minutes passed, and then the door opened and the parlour maid came in. "Mr. Cossey, if you please, sir." "Oh," said the Squire, "where is he?" "In the vestibule, sir." "Very good. Tell him I'll be there in a minute." The maid went. "Now, Ida," said her father, "I suppose we had better get this business over." "Yes," she answered, rising. Chapter 43 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 43. George is seen to laugh. Ida and her father reached the vestibule to find Edward Cossey standing with his face to the mantelpiece and nervously toying with some curiosities upon it. He was, as usual, dressed with great care, and his face, though pale and worn from the effects of agitation of mind, looked, if anything, handsomer than ever. As soon as he heard them coming, which owing to his partial deafness he did not do till they were quite close to him, he turned round with a start, and a sudden flush of colour came upon his pale face. The Squire shook hands with him in a solemn sort of way, like people do when they meet at a funeral, and Ida barely touched his outstretched fingers with her own. A few random remarks followed about the weather, which really for once in a way was equal to the conversational strain put upon it, but at length these died away, and there came an awful pause. It was broken at length by the Squire, who, standing with his back to the fire, his eyes fixed upon the wall opposite, after much humming and hawing, delivered himself thus: "I understand, Mr. Cossey, that you have come to hear my daughter's final decision on the matter of the proposal of marriage which you have made and renewed to her. Now, of course, this is a very important question, very important indeed, and it is one with which I cannot presume even to seem to interfere. Therefore I shall, without comment, leave my daughter to speak for herself. One moment before she does so," he interrupted, drawing but a poor augury of success from Ida's icy looks, "I have come to renew my offer and to take my final answer, and I beg Miss de la Molle to consider how deep and sincere must be that affection which has endured through so many rebuffs. I know, or at least I fear, that I do not occupy the place in her feelings that I should wish to, but I look to my time to change this. At any rate, I am willing to take my chance. As regards money, I repeat the offer that I have already made." "There, I should not say too much about that," broke in the Squire impatiently. "Oh, why not?" said Ida in bitter sarcasm. "Mr. Cossey knows it is one of the best arguments with our sex. I presume that as a preliminary to the renewal of the engagement, the persecution of my father which is being carried on by your lawyer will cease?" "Absolutely." "And if the engagement is not renewed, the money will of course be called in?" "My lawyers advise that it should be," he answered sullenly. "But see here, Ida, you make your own terms about money. Marriage, after all, is particularly a matter of bargaining, and I am not going to stand out about the price." "You are really most generous," went on Ida in the same bitter tone, the irony of which made her father wince, for he understood her mood better than did her lover. "I only regret that I cannot appreciate the generosity more than I do, but it is at least in my power to give you the return which you deserve, so I can no longer hesitate, but once and for all—" and she stopped dead and stared at the glass door as though she saw a ghost. Both her father and Edward Cossey followed the motion of her eyes, and this is what they saw. Up the steps came Colonel Quaritch and George. Both were pale and weary looking, but the former was at least clean. As for George, this could not be said. His head was still adorned with the red nightcap. His hands were cut and dirty, and on his clothes was an unlimited quantity of encrusted filth. "What the dickens—" began the Squire, and at the moment George, who was leading, knocked at the door. "You can't come in now," roared the squire. "Don't you see that we are engaged?" "But we must come in, squire, begging your pardon," answered George with determination as he opened the door. "We've got that to say as won't keep." "I tell you that it must keep, sir," said the old gentleman, working himself into a rage. "Am I not to be allowed a moment's privacy in my own house? I wonder at your conduct, Colonel Quaritch, in forcing your presence upon me when I tell you that it is not wanted." "I am sure that I apologise, Mr. de la Molle," began the Colonel, utterly taken aback, "but what I have to say is—" "The best way that you can apologise is by withdrawing," answered the Squire with majesty. "I shall be most happy to hear what you have to say on another occasion." "Oh, Squire, don't be such a fool, begging your pardon for the word," said George in exasperation. "Don't you go a knocking your head agin a brick wall." "Will you be off, sir?" roared his master in a voice that made the walls shake. By this time Ida had recovered herself. She seemed to feel that her lover had something to say that concerned her deeply. Probably she read it in his eyes. "Father," she said, raising her voice, "I won't have Colonel Quaritch turned away from the door like that. If you will not admit him, I will go outside and hear what it is that he has to say." In his heart the Squire held Ida in some awe. He looked at her and saw that her eyes were flashing and her breast heaving, and he gave way. "Oh, very well, since my daughter insists on it, pray come in," and he bowed. "If such an intrusion falls in with your ideas of decency, it is not for me to complain." "I accept your invitation," answered Harold, looking very angry, "because I have something to say which you must hear, and hear at once. No, thank you, I will stand. Now, Mr. de la Molle, it is this. Wonderful as it may seem, it has been my fortune to discover the treasure hidden by Sir James de la Molle in the year 1643. There was a universal gasp of astonishment. "What?" said the Squire. "Why, I thought that the whole thing was a myth." "No, that it ain't, sir," said George with a melancholy smile, "'cause I've seen it." Ida had sunk into a chair. "What is the amount?" she asked in a low, eager voice. "I have been unable to calculate exactly, but speaking roughly, it cannot be much under £50,000, estimated on the value of the gold alone. Here is a specimen of it." And Harold pulled out a handful of rials and other coins and poured them on the table. Ida hid her face in her hand, and Edward Cossey, realising what this most unexpected development of events might mean for him, began to tremble. "I should not allow myself to be too much elated, Mr. de la Molle," he said with a sneer, "for even if this tale be true, it is a treasure trove and belongs to the crown." "Ah," said the Squire, "I never thought of that." "But I have," said the Colonel quietly. "If I remember right, the last of the original de la Molles left a will in which he specially devised this treasure hidden by his father to your ancestor. That is the identical treasure that I am fortunately in a position to prove by this parchment." And he laid the writing that he had found with the gold upon the table. Quite right," said the Squire. "That will take it out of the custom." "Perhaps the Solicitor to the Treasury may hold a different opinion," said Cossey with another sneer. Just then Ida took her hand from her face. There was a dewy look about her eyes, and the last ripples of a happy smile lingered round the corners of her mouth. "Now that we have heard what Colonel Quaritch had to say," she said in her softest voice, addressing her father, "there is no reason why we should not finish our business with Mr. Cossey." Here Harold and George turned to go, but she waved them back imperiously and began speaking before anyone could interfere, taking up her speech where she had broken it off when she caught sight of the Colonel and George coming up the steps. "I can no longer hesitate," she said, "but once and for all I decline to marry you, Mr. Cossey, and I hope that I shall never see your face again." At this announcement the bewildered Squire put his hand to his head. Edward Cossey staggered visibly and rested himself against the table, while George murmured audibly, "That's a good job." "Listen," said Ida, rising from her chair, her dark eyes flashing as the thought of all shame and agony that she had undergone rose up within her mind. "Listen, Mr. Cossey," and she pointed her finger at him. "This is the history of our connection. Some months ago I was so foolish, taking you for a gentleman, as to ask your help in the matter of the mortgages which your bank was calling in. You then practically made terms that if it should be at any time your wish I should become engaged to you, and I having no option accepted. Then in the interval, while it was inconvenient to you to enforce your rights, I gave my affections elsewhere. But when you, having deserted the lady who stood in your way, do not interrupt me. I know it all. I know it from her own lips, came forward and claimed my promise, I was forced to assent. Then a loophole of escape presented itself, and I availed myself of it. What followed? You again became possessed of power over my father and this place. You insulted the man I loved. You resorted to every expedient that the law would allow to torture my father and myself. You set your lawyers upon us like dogs upon a hare. You held ruin over us, and again you offered me money, as much money as I wished, if only I would sell myself to you. And then you bided your time, leaving despair to do its work. I saw the toils closing around us. I knew that if I did not yield, my father would be driven from his home in his old age, and that the place he loved better than his life would pass to strangers, would pass to you. No, father, do not stop me. I will speak my mind. And at last I determined that, cost what it might, I would yield. Whether I could have carried out my determination, God only knows. I almost think that I should have killed myself upon my marriage day. I made up my mind. Not 5 minutes ago the very words were upon my lips that would have sealed my fate, when deliverance came. And now go. I have done with you. Your money shall be paid to you, capital and interest, down to the last farthing. I tender back my price, and knowing you for what you are, I despise you. That is all I have to say." "Well, if that bean't a master one," ejaculated George aloud. Ida, who had never looked more beautiful than she did in this moment of passion, turned to seat herself, but the tension of her feelings and the torrent of her wrath and eloquence had been too much for her, and she would have fallen had not Harold, who had been listening amazed to this overpowering outburst of nature, ran up and caught her in his arms. As for Edward Cossey, he had shrunk back involuntarily beneath the volume of her scorn, till he stood with his back against the panelled wall. His face was white as a sheet. Despair and fury shone in his large dark eyes. Never had he desired this woman more fiercely than he did now, in the moment when he knew that she had escaped him for ever. In a sense he was to be pitied, for passion tore his heart in twain. For a moment he stood thus, and then with a spring rather than a step he advanced across the room till he was face to face with Harold, who, with Ida half fainting, still in his arms, and her head upon his shoulder, was standing on the further side of the great open grate. "Blank you," he said, "I owe this to you, you half-pay adventurer," and he lifted his arm as though to strike him. "Come, none of that," said the Squire, speaking for the first time. "I will have no brawling here." "No," put in George, edging his long form between the two, "and begging your pardon, sir, don't you go a calling of better men than yourself adventurers. At any rate, if the Colonel is an adventurer, he has adventured to some purpose, as is easy to see," and he pointed to Ida lying in his arms. "Hold your tongue, sir," roared the Squire, as usual, relieving his feelings on his retainer. "You are always shoving your oar in where it isn't wanted." "All right, Squire, all right," said George the imperturbable. "Then his manners shouldn't be sich." "Do you mean to allow this?" said Cossey, turning fiercely to the old gentleman. "Do you mean to allow this man to marry your daughter for her money?" "Mr. Cossey," answered the squire, with his politest and most old-fashioned bow. "Whatever sympathy I may have felt for you is being rapidly alienated by your manner. I told you that my daughter must speak for herself. She has spoken very clearly, and in short I have absolutely nothing to add to her words." "I tell you what it is," said Cossey, shaking with fury. "I have been tricked and fooled and played with, and so sure as there is a God above us, I will have my revenge on you all somehow. The money that this man says that he has found belongs to the Queen and not to you, and I will take care that the proper people are informed of it before you can make away with it. And when that is taken from you, if indeed the whole thing is not a trick, we will see what will happen to you. I will tell you that I will take this property, and I will pull this old place you are so fond of down stone by stone and throw it into the moat and send the plough over the site. I will sell the estate piecemeal and blot it out. I tell you I have been tricked. You encouraged the marriage yourself. You know you did, and you forbade that man the house." And he paused for a breath and to collect his words. Again the squire bowed, and his bow was a study in itself. You do not see such bows nowadays. "1 minute, Mr. Cossey," he said very quietly, for it was one of his peculiarities to become abnormally quiet in circumstances of real emergency, "and then I think that we may close this painful interview. When first I knew you I did not like you. Afterwards, through various circumstances, I modified my opinion and set my dislike down to prejudice. You are quite right in saying that I encouraged the idea of a marriage between you and my daughter, and also that I forbade the house to Colonel Quaritch. I did so because, to be honest, I saw no other way of avoiding the utter ruin of my family, but perhaps I was wrong in so doing. I hope that you may never be placed in a position which will force you to such a decision. Also, at the time, indeed never till this moment, have I quite realised how the matter really stood. I did not understand how strongly my daughter was attached in another direction. Perhaps I was unwilling to understand it. Nor did I altogether understand the course of action by which, it seems, you obtained a promise of marriage from my daughter in the first instance. I was anxious for the marriage because I believed you to be a better man than you are, and because I thought that it would place my daughter and her descendants in a much improved position, and that she would in time become attached to you. I forbade Colonel Quaritch the house because I thought that an alliance with him would be most undesirable for everybody concerned. I find that in all this I was acting wrongly, and I frankly admit it. Perhaps as we grow old we grow worldly also, and you and your agents pressed me very hard, Mr. Cossey. Still, I have always told you that my daughter was a free agent and must decide for herself, and therefore I owe you no apology on that score. So much then for the question of your engagement to Miss de la Molle. It is done with. And now, as regards the threats you make, I shall try to meet them as occasion arises, and if I cannot do so, it will be my misfortune. But one thing they show me, though I am sorry to have to say it to any man in a house which I can still call my own, they show me that my first impressions of you were the correct ones. You are not a gentleman, Mr. Cossey, and I must beg to decline the honour of your further acquaintance." And with another bow he opened the vestibule door and stood holding the handle in his hand. Edward Cossey looked round with a stare of rage, and then muttering one most comprehensive curse, he stalked from the room, and in another minute was driving fast through the ancient gateway. Poor man, let us pity him, for he also certainly got his full due. George followed him to the outer door, and then he did a thing that nobody had seen him do before. He burst out into a loud laugh. "What are you making that noise about?" asked his master sternly. "This is no laughing matter." "Him," replied George, pointing to the retreating dog-cart. "He's a-going to pull down the castle and throw it into the moat and send the plough over it, is he? Him, that varmint! Why, them old towers will be a-standing there when his beggarly bones is dust, and when his name ain't no more a name, and there'll be one of the old blood sitting in them too. I know it, and I have always knowed it. Come, Squire, though you always do say how I is a fool, what did I tell you? I did tell you that Providence weren't a-going to let this place go to any lawyers or bankers or them sort. Why, course I did, and now you see, not but what is owing to the Colonel. He was the man that found it, but then God Almighty taught him how to do it. But he's a good un, he is, and a gentleman, not like him." And he once more pointed with unutterable scorn to the road down which Edward Cossey had vanished. "Now look here," said the Squire, "don't you stand talking here all day about things you don't understand. That's the way you waste time. You be off and look after this gold. It should not be left alone, you know. We will come down presently to Molehill, for I suppose that's where it is. No, I can't stop to hear the story now, and besides I want Colonel Quaritch to tell it to me." "All right, Squire," said George, touching his red nightcap. "I'll be off." And he started. "George!" halloaed his master after him, but George did not stop. He had a trick of deafness when the Squire was calling, and he wanted to go somewhere else. "Confound you!" roared the old gentleman. "Why don't you stop when I call you?" This time George brought his long, lank frame to a standstill. "Beg pardon, Squire." "Beg pardon, yes, you're always begging pardon. Look here, you had better bring your wife and have dinner in the servants' hall to-day, and drink a glass of port." "Thank you, Squire," said George, again touching his red nightcap. "And look here, George, give me your hand, man. Here's a Merry Christmas to you. We've gone through some queerish times about this place together, but now it almost looks as though we're going to end our days in peace and plenty." "Same to you, Squire, I'm sure, same to you," said George, pulling off his cap. Yes, we've had some bad years, what with poor Mr. James and that Quest and Cossey, he's the master varmint of the lot, he is, and the bad times and the moat farm and all, but bless you, Squire, now that there'll be some ready money and no debts, why, if I don't make out somehow so that you'll all get a good living out of the place, I'm a Dutchman. Yes, it's been a bad time and we're getting old, but there, that's how it is. The sky's almost always clear toward nightfall. God Almighty has a mind to let one down easy, I suppose. If you would talk a little less about God Almighty and come to church a little more, it would be a good thing, as I Chapter 44 of Colonel Quaritch, V.C. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Colonel Quaritch, V.C. by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 44. Christmas Chimes. The Squire turned and entered the house. He generally was fairly noisy in his movements, but on this occasion he was exceptionally so. Possibly he had a reason for it. On reaching the vestibule he found Harold and Ida standing side by side as though they were being drilled. It was impossible to resist the conclusion that they had suddenly assumed that attitude because it happened to be the first position into which they could conveniently fall. There was a moment's silence, and then Harold took Ida's hand and led her up to where her father was standing. "Mr. de la Molle," he said simply, "once more I ask you for your daughter in marriage. I am quite aware of my many disqualifications, especially those of my age and the smallness of my means, but Ida and myself hope and believe that under all the circumstances you will no longer withhold your consent." And he paused. "Quaritch," answered the Squire, "I have already in your presence told Mr. Cossey under what circumstances I was favourably inclined to his proposal, so I need not repeat all that. As regards your means, although they would have been quite insufficient to avert the ruin which threatened us, still you have, I believe, a competence, and owing to your wonderful and most providential discovery, the fear of ruin seems to have passed away." It is owing to you that discovery, which, by the way, I want to hear all about, has been made. Had it not been for you, it never would have been made at all, and therefore I certainly have no right to say anything more about your means. As regards your age, well, after all, 44 is not the limit of life, and if Ida does not object to marrying a man of those years, I cannot object to her doing so. With reference to your want of occupation, I think that if you marry Ida, this place will, as times are, keep your hands pretty full, especially when you have an obstinate donkey like that fellow George to deal with, for I am getting too old and stupid to look after it myself, and besides, things are so topsy-turvy that I can't understand them. There is one thing more that I want to say to you. I forbade you the house. Well, you are a generous-minded man, and it is human to err, and I think that perhaps you will understand my actions and not bear me a grudge on that account. Also, I dare say that at the time, and possibly at other times, I said things that I should be sorry for if I could remember what they were, which I can't. And if so, I apologise to you as a gentleman should when he finds himself in the wrong. And now I say God bless you both, and hopes you will be happy in life together. And so come here, Ida, my love, and give me a kiss. You have been a good daughter all your life, and so Quaritch may be sure that you will be a good wife too." Ida did as she was bid, and then she went over to her lover and took his hand, and he kissed her on the forehead, and so, after all their troubles, they finally ratified the contract. And we, who have followed them thus far, have perhaps been a little moved by their struggles, hopes and fears, will not surely grudge to re-echo the squire's old-fashioned prayer, "God bless them both." God bless them both. Long may they live, and happily. Long may they live, and for very long may their children's children of the race, if not of the name of de la Molle, pass in and through the old Norman gateway, and past the sturdy Norman towers. The Boisseys who built them here had their habitation for 6 generations. The de la Molles, who wedded the heiress of the Boisseys, lived here for 13 generations. May the Quaritches, whose ancestor married Ida, heiress of the de la Molles, endure as long. Surely it is permitted to us to lift a corner of the curtain of futurity to see, in spirit, Ida Quaritch, stately and beautiful as we know her, but of a happier countenance, seated on some Christmas Eve to come, in the drawing-room of the castle, and telling to the children at her knees the wonderful tale of how their father and old George, on this very night when the great gale blew long years ago, discovered the ruddy pile of gold hoarded in that awful storehouse amid the bones of Saxon or Danish heroes, and thus saved her to be their mother. We can surely see the wide and wondering eyes and the fixed faces as for the 10th time they listen to a story before which the joys of Crusoe will grow pale, and hear the eager appeals for confirmation made to the military-looking gentleman, very grizzled now, but grown better looking with the advancing years, who is standing warming himself before the fire, the best and most beloved husband and father in the whole countryside. Perhaps there may be a vacant chair and another tomb among the ranks of the departed de la Molles. Perhaps the ancient walls will no longer echo to the sound of the old squire's stentorian voice, and what of that? It is our common lot. But when he goes, the countryside will lose a man of whom they will not see the like again, for the breed is dead or dying. A man whose very prejudices, inconsistencies, and occasional wrong-headed violence will be held, when he is no longer here, to have been endearing qualities, and for manliness, for downright English God-fearing virtues, for love of queen, country, family, and home, they may search in vain to find his equal among the thin-blooded gentility of the cosmopolitan Englishman of the dawning 20th century. His faults were many, and at one time he went near to sacrificing his daughter to save his house, but he would not have been the man he was without them. And so to him too, farewell. Perhaps he will find himself a better place in the Valhalla of his forefathers, surrounded by those stout old de la Molles, whose memory he regarded with so much affection, than here in the Victorian era. For, as has been said elsewhere, the old squire would undoubtedly have looked better in a chain shirt and a battle axe than ever he did in a frock coat, especially with his retainer George armed to the teeth behind him. They kissed, and it was done, and out from the church tower in the meadows broke with a clash and clangour the glad sound of the Christmas bells. Out it swept, over piddle and fallow, over grove and wood. It floated down the valley of the Ell. It beat against Dead Man's Mount, henceforth to the vulgar mind more haunted than ever, and echoed up the castle's Norman towers, and down the oak-clad vestibule. Away over the common went the glad message of earth's Saviour, away high into the air, startling the rooks upon their airy courses, as though the iron notes of the world's rejoicing would fain float to the throned feet of the world's everlasting King. Peace and goodwill, aye, happiness to the children of men while their span is, and hope for the beyond, and heaven's blessing on holy love and all good things that are. This was what those liquid notes seemed to say to the most happy pair who stood hand in hand in the vestibule, and thought of all they had escaped and all they had won. "Well, Quaritch, if you and Ida have quite done staring at each other, which isn't very interesting to a third party, perhaps you will not mind telling us how you happened on old Sir James de la Mole's hoard." Thus adjured, Harold began his thrilling story, telling the whole history of the night in detail, and if his hearers had expected to be astonished, certainly their expectations were considerably more than fulfilled. "Upon my word," said the squire when he had done, "I think I am beginning to grow superstitious in my old age. Hang me if I don't believe it was the finger of Providence itself that pointed out those letters to you. Anyway, I am off to see the spoil. Run and get your hat, Ida, my dear, and we will all go together." And they went and looked at the chest, brimful of red gold, yes, and passed down, all three of them, into those chill presences in the bowels of the mount, and coming thence, awed and silent, sealed up the place for ever. End of chapter 44. Conclusion. Goodbye. On the following morning, such inhabitants of Boisingham as happened to be about were much interested at seeing an ordinary farm trumble coming down the main street, and being driven, or rather led, by no less a person than George himself, while behind it walked the well-known form of the old squire, arm in arm with Colonel Quaritch. They were still more interested, however, when the tumble drew up at the door of the bank, not Causey's, but the opposition bank, where, although it was Boxing Day, the manager and the clerk were waiting, apparently for its coming. But their interest culminated when they perceived that the cart only contained a few flour sacks, and yet that each of these sacks seemed to require 3 or 4 men to lift it without any comfort. Thus the gold was safely housed. Upon being weighed, its value was found to be about £53,000 of modern money. As, however, some of the coins were exceedingly rare and of great value to museums and collectors, this value was considerably increased, and the treasure was ultimately sold for £55,254. Only Ida kept back enough of the choicest coins to make a gold waistband or girdle and a necklace for herself, destined no doubt in future days to form the most cherished heirloom of the Quaritch family. On that same evening the squire and Harold went to London and opened up communications with the solicitor to the Treasury. Fortunately they were able to refer to the will of Sir Edward de la Mole, the second baronet, in which he specially devised to his cousin Geoffrey Dofferleigh and his heirs for ever, not only his estates but his lands, together with the treasure hidden thereon or elsewhere by my late murdered father, Sir James de la Mole. Also they produced the writing which Ida had found in the old Bible, and the parchment discovered by George among the coin. These 3 documents formed a chain of evidence which even officials interested for the Treasury could not refuse to admit, and in the upshot the Crown renounced its claims, and the property in the gold passed to the squire, subject to the payment of the same succession duty which he would have been called upon to meet had he inherited a like sum from a cousin at the present time. And so it came to pass that when the mortgage money was due, it was paid to the last farthing, capital and interest, and Edward Cossey lost his hold upon Honham for ever. As for Edward Cossey himself, we may say one more word about him. In the course of time he got over his violent passion for Ida sufficiently to allow him to make a brilliant marriage with the only daughter of an impecunious peer. She keeps her name and title, and he plays the part of the necessary husband. Anyhow, my reader, if it is your glorious fortune to frequent the gilded saloons of the great, you may meet Lady Honoria Talbot and Mr. Cossey. If you do meet him, however, it may be well to avoid him, for the events of his life have not been of a nature to improve his temper. This much then of Edward Cossey. If after leaving the gilded saloons aforesaid you should happen to wander down Piccadilly or the Strand, as the case may be, you may meet another character in this history. You may see a sweet pale face, still stamped with a childlike roundness and simplicity, but half hidden in the coarse hood of the nun. You may see her, and if you care to follow, you may find what is the work wherein she seeks her peace. It would shock you, you would fly from it in horror, but in her work of mercy and loving kindness, and she does it unflinchingly, and among her fellow nuns there is no one more beloved than Sister Agnes. So goodbye to her also. Harold Quaritch and Ida were married in the spring, and the village children strewed the churchyard path, the same path where in anguish of soul they had met and parted on that dreary winter's night, with primroses and violets. And there at the old church door, when the wreath is on her brow and the veil about her face, let us bid farewell to Ida and her husband Harold Quaritch. The End.